Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bay Area Content Marketing Meetup. Today, we are centered in the Bay Area, but today myself and our presenters are in the Chicago area, fighting through some tornado warnings, but everything is okay, knock on wood. We have Susan and Scott Westwater of Pragmatic Digital. They're going to talk about how content marketers can use AI inside the work, not just after the work is done. Susan and Scott will look at what AI needs to produce more useful drafts, how teams can spot the patterns that make AI sound generic, and how a clearer workflow can help teams improve quality, consistency, and review over time. You attendees will receive a link to a checklist that you can use to review AI assisted content so it sounds more human and more aligned with the brand. Susan and Scott, thanks for joining and take it away.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
Dennis.
you. Um, One quick thing that I always like to start with, and as we're talking about today, is there's a lot of talk about using AI on what I call the edges, and that's the clean this up, those particular things. But as we have been working in this space, we founded Pragmatic in 2017. We've really focused on how do we make it a part of the work. So the frame that I like to think of it as working with AI as opposed to having AI do the work. And that's where we're going to be focusing on content today, but obviously because of this particular group. But there's other ways that this can apply as we think about the workflow first approach as opposed to the tool or model approach.
Yep. So just a little bit about us. Like Sue said, we founded Pragmatic back in 2017. We've got deep roots in conversational and voice AI. And as a matter of fact, we actually wrote two books on the topic. The last one called Voice Marketing was actually forwarded by Phil Kotler, and it was a Barry Book Award finalist for the American Marketing Association Foundation. So it was basically recognized as an innovative text, specifically talking about innovation and how it applies to marketing. So we've written two books, and at the end of the day, we're here to help marketing teams and content creators actually use AI to improve the work. So it's not about, just like Sue said, it's not about just polishing it at the very end. It's how do we use this in a meaningful way, potentially for research and other activities that relate to content creation. So today we're going to focus specifically on the content workflows and how you can actually create stronger, more consistent content with your AI platforms.
So we've got basically four acts today, and before we move into Q&A and a little bit of discussion. But starting initially with like, why is it when we talk about AI slop, one of my biggest frustrations with the whole, hey, this is AI slop, is that there's a lot of folks who don't feel comfortable writing, who are producing inadvertently AI slop. I don't think anyone on this call or in this group are, but the notion is like, why does it? Why is it like that? Faster isn't always better. I think we all agree to that. So what are those inputs then that we need for that better content? We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk also about the whole workflow in general, because AI actually has a place during, before we start doing outputs, during that whole process, and then even after and when we do our reviews. There's a very distinct part of it, and there's very much a human element to most of those. And then and with where to start, sort of like one idea of where we can start to look at that process and then what we can do next.
So, I mean, there's no shortage of promise that we've heard. And there's been, I mean, we've lived through the hype cycle for 7, 8 years. So, like, I know this sounds familiar to everyone, but, AI is going to save a lot of time. It's going to create more content, which it certainly has, but it hasn't reduced the rewriting. So, that's a big part of it. It helps teams, smaller teams, bigger teams move faster. And the gist of it was supposed to help make content easier to produce and good content, quite frankly. But the reality is, we know the drafts are faster, but it's a lot of extra review time that has to happen just because we don't necessarily have our audience information in there, right? We don't have a unique point of view. There's a lot of components that go into that rewrite, but the drafts are super fast. But we've done is really moved the effort from upfront to after the fact, after the first draft was actually created. A lot of teams are trying to improve their outputs by tweaking the prompts instead of actually fixing things upstream. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. But that's actually a huge aha and a huge piece of what we've discovered over the past few years is it's just as much having the right prompts, but also having the right inputs, the right source material, the right voice documentation, etc., so that it actually all works together. Typically, because these models are really good at knowing a lot of stuff, they know a lot of stuff, but they don't get super deep into topics or certainly specifically into our industries, our brands, our businesses, etc. So that's why we're starting to see such generic content. It's literally because it's creating averages of what it thinks a business writing piece should be. So if you're not providing all that additional context, you're basically sounding like everyone else because the models don't have the right information to pull from. And what basically ends up happening is your senior people end up spending a lot of time reviewing, rewriting, re-editing. We've certainly seen a lot of posts from ghostwriters or editors that are like, I'm upcharging any sort of AI output. But it's because our senior folks are spending way too much time on rewriting after the fact. So there's definitely ways we can start to address the things upstream so that doesn't really happen. And then the big thing that we've seen is historically, past 2 or 3 years, AI is really sitting kind of on the edges, like Sue had mentioned. So it's really on the margins of the work. It's not embedded within the workflows typically. It's not really foundational in how this stuff is coming out. So that's another piece. So it's not just about having it kind of sprinkled in little places. It's how can we, once we get comfortable with it, how can we meaningfully implement the technology in different facets, try it out, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, we try something different. But that's really kind of where we're at as far as we hear all this great stuff. But the reality is, once you got into an organization, it's a little bit more messy. Each individual organization behaves differently. Their processes are different. Their workflows are different. So that's really kind of where we're at in late 2026, mid 2026, is companies are now starting to go, we haven't seen the results. We haven't seen the promise of it. What do we do to actually make sure we're starting to get more of that?
Yeah, and the other side of that too is there's clients that we work with who are in extremely regulated industries, such as financial services, legal, insurance. They cannot, or their general notion is, I can't just do a prompt and do an output. So can I use AI? Where are my AI opportunities? And there are opportunities of where you can use AI. It doesn't, again, it's using it to help with pattern recognition and insights. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But there are opportunities beyond just checking your grammar or beyond, there's lots of ways that we can shape things ahead of time that make it easier and more insightful, because the goal is better work, not just faster more.
Right.
So this notion of what we've been looking at as we talked about how we move things along, as Scott was saying, senior writers are doing more things. There's more. Just because we can make more doesn't mean it makes faster. We've just pushed things down into this notion of what we've called review debt. And I think, as content creators and content marketers, we've experienced this a lot, right? Hey, we need to get everything out. Oh, but it's stuck in this one bottleneck. We're just moving the bottleneck around. So what we have been calling this is review debt, from a notion of, is it the time? Is it the senior attention? What is it? And then it's not necessarily removing the editorial bottleneck. It's actually just the review. So is it that senior time of where we've got the senior writers and reviewers are spending way more time fixing things that could have been caught up ahead of time? And by the way, some of this, I'll be honest with people in this room, I expect that some of you are going, well, duh, that's why you need to have reviews. This is where we've looked at it, is kind of saying, let's look at that original analog workflow. Let's look at where we can have these opportunities. So brand drift, it starts to sound generic, or the even bigger challenge is there's that one person who has the brand voice in their head. How do we extract that? How do we find out and identify so that we have that briefing? And then this endless review of having to go through iterations. So we've got feedback cycles. So I've got drafts for you to look at, but are they better to be looking at? Are they even ready for that? And then that also starts to then make the team, as they experience those first three pieces, they start to lose confidence in it. And that's where we hear, oh, this just makes AI slap. Oh, this is just, it's crap. It's not what we need. I'm just going to go back to doing it myself more manually. That's where then we have this impact of review debt.
Yep. And so it's really not a prompt problem. If you add better prompts on top of a broken workflow, you're just going to get better looking garbage, and that's really what we're talking about. And that's kind of the current state of AI content, especially when you start to see people talking about AI slop. It doesn't sound like our brand. It doesn't have a point of view, things like that.
It rambles.
In a world where, this versus that kind of a thing. And so there's really like three areas that we've identified which can actually help turn those better prompts and better inputs into better results. And the first one is your weak source material. So when we brief humans, we have content briefs, we have audience information, we have, information that we're basing it on. Typically, when people sit down and start with content in ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, I want to write a blog post about blah, 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 and just kind of going off there. So starting with good good source material, good documentation, having project briefs, having great examples and references that actually say, here's what we actually have already established is good. So the problem is we're not doing enough of that, but the reality is there are ways that we can actually improve that upstream piece so that it's pulling all of those information or that insights through to your content pieces. Another big piece is this unclear voice rules. So like we were doing a workshop with a client a couple of weeks ago, and literally they said this, professional but approachable. And they acknowledge that that is not a unique differentiator, but that's how they've expressed their brand. Because again, that was typically written for humans to interpret and go, okay, I kind of get the gist of this, and they would write against it. These systems are very literal. So if you don't provide enough context about what your brand is, what it sounds like, your word choice, what your audience is looking for, things like that, you're going to have a much harder time of generating things that are actually clearly from the brand. So it's a matter of giving it the right prompts, the right examples, the right voice guidance. And I think this is probably a good time to talk about this. So Sue and I actually did this experiment a few weeks back where we actually had ChatGPT pull our voice and tone guides based on all the work we've been doing with it over the past 3 years. Mine was 11 points, and I'm not a writer by trade. I'm a visual designer, UX guy. I've been on the visual design side. She's a double English major. She's 2 credits short of being a medievalist.
Yeah.
Her voice and tone documentation was 28 points. So very specific feedback because she has worked so much with the system to say, no, 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 not like that. I hate doing these types of things. I would rather use these types of. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say I've been relentless and I've made myself, those moments where you say, forget it, I'll just take what I've got and finish it myself. I've been trying to hold myself probably the past 6 months of no, I'm going to make it get it until it's right. And that's how I ended up with 27 points. Now, yeah, thee and thou, yes, all those things, even things like I would never use that phrase. I always like to position things in a positive. So if it's a negative statement, I'd rather make it productive forward. All those little things that make me. I'm aware of that because again, double English major, editor, have done enough editorial. The reality is you don't need 27 points. No. But the reality is though is getting from professional but approachable to these and thous, there's a point in between there that we need to be intentional about. And we also need to share that. So if we're a team of one, that's one thing. That kind of makes our world a little bit easier. Yep. But if we're across a team, let's make sure that everyone does know what the these and thou rule is. Let's make sure that everyone knows that. And one of the opportunities, and again, some of this is sort of, well, isn't that good content marketing 101? This is forcing it. Yep. All those things like, well, if it isn't the consequences of my actions. That brand team that didn't ever just said, oh, that person will know it when they see it. Well, none of these models will know it when they see it. So we have to give them that specificity. By the way, that's an incredible opportunity as a team to codify. Yep. This is actually how we sound. This is the voice and tone. Very much like how Andy Welfie and Michael Metz talk in writing is designing. Let's think about voice and tone as two separate things. Let's start to give that guidance. And that's why when we talk about non-examples, sometimes, let's be honest, it's what we're not going to do. Right. And that's a helpful thing as well, because that sets the positive guideline and the negative guideline of this is the boundaries of where I want you to work within. That helps keep that more consistent. And as we are looking at things like AEO or what does ChatGPT say about my brand when I'm not in the room, the more consistent our content gets, the stronger and more clear we are about our brand. The chances are that that's going to get picked up more than if we have disparate because in one social manager is doing it this way, another public blog is this other way. These are things that can help us align those stars to make that stronger. It's just we now suddenly have a little bit more pain and motivation to get more intentional about those particular things.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, all of this work that you do here for content also applies in conversational AI. So any chat bots or voice
Yep.
assistants, social content. So literally you're almost creating a brand guideline on steroids. And that is something that can then inform across divisions, across teams, across the organization, quite frankly, so that your sales team sounds like the company, the marketing team sounds like the company, anything that's PR, externally facing, it's all coming kind of from that same central corpus. So you now have consistent brand content across the entire ecosystem, which back in the day when we were just doing one website, with a basic couple pages on one breakpoint, print collateral and TV, it was super easy to be consistent across the board. Now there's so many different touch points, and then these systems are generatively talking on our behalf. So all of these voice rules, all of this stuff we're talking about here also applies to the larger world of anything that would actually be internal or external facing. The other piece and the last bit of this that we've observed is inconsistent review criteria. So someone somewhere within the organization knows what good sounds like, but a lot of times it's locked up in their head. And so you might have, some guidance as far as we typically look for this type of information in these. We have these kind of claim rules. We have this kind of brand that needs to be built in. But a lot of it is I'll know it when I see it. So what has happened is these systems have kind of exposed that we haven't documented necessarily as much as what good looks like. So that's why we keep hammering on this idea of having examples and non-examples. Here's examples of good, here's examples of things that we wouldn't say, just to make sure that the systems actually know what you deem is actually acceptable, credible, and good versus something that's more generic.
And this is all moving towards a more complete way of thinking about governance. Governance so many times is thought of as control and avoid the risk. How do I stop? This is actually a way of also looking at that other side of governance of enabling and saying, here's the sandbox that we can play in from voice, tone, claims, etc., that everyone agrees upon. And again, it's also making sure that all the teams look at that.
Yep.
If anyone's ever seen my things, I've written a couple pieces about this, of the notion of better ingredients, better pizza. And this is, again, looking at that idea of the edges of, we've all made that pizza. We've all gotten that less than amazing pizza and trying to make it taste better. You can only put so much Parmesan cheese and crushed pepper into something once it comes out of the oven. So what if we could take a step back and think about, how do I improve those ingredients to begin with? So this fun little metaphor that, you throw something out in the world and then you realize that now for the rest of my life, I'm going to be a Papa John's pizza salesperson, is the notion of the oven. The oven are the models and the tools. They're incredibly fast. They're improving weekly. The reality is that models rarely are the actual problem. And actually one of the things, so when Fable came out and everyone's like, I need to do Fable, we actually had to talk with a couple teams and say, you don't need Fable to fix the content you're working on right now. You don't need those big models. It's more of looking at looking at what is it that's going to be able to do that so I can manage those things. And then we look at the ingredients, the detailed briefs, again, validated metrics. What is good look like? What are we trying to do? What are the cases? How have we handled this in the past? Because again, sometimes, like, let's say I was chilling with a team that does social care. They would never cut and paste from ChatGPT a response to someone's comment. However, they would use that same type of thing in that project of, how have I handled this before? So thinking about those different ways of putting things to look at from there. And then the recipe, right? So that is our steps that help us understand. It goes from A to B to C. How do we get those things done? I have a lot of folks that'll say to me, we don't have a process. Do you get things done? You do have a process. You may not like that process. You may not like that workflow. There's an opportunity to look at that, but let's start from there. And then you start to be able to, in order to be able to know where you can cut things or where you can expedite, you need to first understand how it gets done. And then you can start to look at where you're taking those, either a calculated risk, or you're saying, you know what, those two things can do the double duty. So that's where workflow and review. This all lends up to a feeling of, when folks talk to me about AI content and AI slop, I'm not mad that you used AI. I'm actually really excited. I'm mad you didn't proofread it or review it. I'm mad you didn't look at what that output was or those particular things. So that's kind of, as we think about these areas, these are our opportunities of where we can again look at where AI can work within that.
And so what we've identified, like again, over the past 3 years of working with these systems, both with clients and also for our own internal purposes. I mean, we are a team of 2 people. We perform at the level of a team of 5 to 7, I would argue, maybe even more. And it's just because we've gotten really good at leveraging these systems as much as possible and codifying a lot of our thought process and, quite frankly, what we want to write about so that it becomes less about just sitting down and staring at that blank screen, but we're actually strategically starting from a framework. But really, it depends on having a clear purpose. So what are you trying to achieve with the content? So again, content brief, having all of those things figured out up ahead. So like, SEO keywords, and anything you would normally do to brief a human, you want to do here. So it doesn't have to be exhaustive, but you certainly want to put some strict guidance down so that it knows kind of the sandbox to play in. Also having that strong source material. So any sort of facts you want to pull from, examples, quotes, if you have transcripts from an interview, internal knowledge, those are really all going to be unique to you, your organization, your brand. And so effectively, that's going to be your moat. So having all of this information in a centralized place, and we'll actually address that question in the comments at the end, but having all of that information centralized in either a project, a custom GPT, whatever platform you're working with, but having that information centralized so that when you're actually creating your content, it's pulling from that source material. There's also skills and a bunch of other stuff where you can have repeatable processes that pull from that same information. A little bit more advanced level, but the idea is instead of having a single prompt that you're working with, it's something that can be invoked within, different applications within it, but it's all repeatable. So you're getting consistent outputs, and then you're just making sure that you have the right inputs there. The voice piece is probably the biggest piece that we see time and time again. I mean, we were 25+ year advertising veterans. And so I can't tell you how many brand guidelines that I've seen that even for human writers and human creatives, they still fall a little bit short and there's still a lot of interpretation that happens. So having a lot of your guidance on what the content should sound like, what the brand should sound like, all of the rules around word choice and things like that, having that all sussed out is also incredibly important. And then, like we said, those quality standards on the back end. So making sure that you have them identified before you start so that you're tracking against those. And then you're actually reviewing against those standards. That's really, at the end of the day, one of the biggest missing pieces that we've seen. Worked with teams internally at agencies and on the brand side where they have one person or 2 people that basically have all that institutional knowledge locked up in their brain. So if they're not in that day, that stuff doesn't get reviewed. So this is also a great way to start to share that knowledge so it becomes less individual and more tribal.
Yeah, and with like the quality standards, like that checklist where we share with you, obviously it's not the end all be all that it will never change as we add things. I do want to say in favor of M dashes. I again, M dashes have always been my friend. Also have parentheses. There are times where use it just oh, they might tag me. If your audience knows you and that's how you've always been, absolutely. Yeah. It's more about the, hey, this is who I am and this is how I sound like, as opposed to the super wordy run-on sentences with nothing but 13 dependent clauses in it. And we've all seen that. So it's looking at that. But there are ways that you can actually have it check itself as well of saying, hey, at least look for the main things that look there. I still need to review it as a human and make sure and gut check it of, hey, that's me. Like I have a very verbose vocabulary. It's sometimes okay where I will be using certain words that's me. And my audience will know that because that's how I've always written. It's when you start drifting off and start using those language or really odd things that where the heck did that come from? Then that doesn't make sense. And those are the things where we are having it check itself, but again, not losing the human part of it. One of the other things too, and we'll talk about this a little, is measuring how long it's taking you to do something before, and then measuring how long it takes you to do it as you're going through this process of refining and iterating your process. It's important to have those baselines as opposed to, did we do more? Is it, hey, did I have more drafts? Did I have those particular things? That's another part of that quality standard, because AI native or AI forward thinking doesn't mean AI all the time.
Yeah.
It means AI where I need it or where I can help me make my work better.
Yeah, and one last bit on the quality. One thing you could do is work with multiple models. So if you're using Claude to generate your content, use ChatGPT with all your quality checks in there and have it do that first pass to make sure that Claude hasn't missed anything or inadvertently, gone off the rails, as it were. So also being able to use different models. I typically don't use the same model to check that model's work, but I will use other models with the right inputs and the right information in there to just do a first pass. Then I will actually go through and me manually review it, make any sort of editorial comments, any sort of updates that I need to do, and then off to the races. So that's just a way that I found to be, especially with like Grok and some of the other ones that people might not either be familiar or using as much. There are ways that you can actually use it to do that checking, at least for that first pass.
So patterns of generic AI, I think we just talked about a little bit about this, but there's some generals, such as like not using any contractions and being too stiff. Again, if it's part of your brand, that is, but these are also areas for you to think about, where are these additional decisions we need to make? And it is going a little bit deeper as to what that brand sounds like. By the way, that doesn't mean everything has to sound identical. It means, what are the most important aspects of this brand? There was a CPG brand that I was working with, and it was things along the lines of, am I talking to really, that mom that knows everything who I trust? Or am I talking to a friend? Or am I talking to a scientist? How are those different personalities? What are those then? And then how does that change that language? Those are some of the things you have to think about with what we want it to do and what that brand of, in this particular channel, we want this. It is that being a lot more intentional and thoughtful, but you can also share that with your whole team. And it's like, oh, wow, that's amazing. The other thing is the uniform length. Like we've talked about that, of humans don't read, humans have a rhythm. We're going to need to make sure that we have that rhythm within that place. Vague generalities. I think we've all heard this. Those people always ask me, or some of those larger, broader. Honestly, these are some things that as writers and content creators, we think and go, well, this isn't good writing. That's where we're at. Defensive hedging too, the mites and the coulds, provided legal. You're not using legal claims, because I know legal every day has figured out 6 ways to Sunday that we have to sometimes hedge. But again,
Healthcare.
right? And then also then the whole idea of being less abstract, getting down to that human level of, I'm not going to talk generality and vague and hide in those shadows. Again, using the specificity that I would use as a human, but that's also because I have to inform it. Where would that specificity? So that's, again, where our input is very, very helpful. As much as folks love to pick on Copilot, a lot of our clients live in that environment. There's the work and there's the web settings. The work setting is where we can really sometimes get behind the firewall and say, this is my corpus, work from there. That's a helpful way of then again saying, I need you to be specific from here and not just summarizing 5 things that you found on the web. And then the 7 writing signals that AI needs. So again, this is where we start talking about, like, we need to say more than make it human. We need to make it sound like brand X. We need to give specific signals, similar to how we'd brief a human, right? Or at least that's the exercise of how we look at that. Again, how direct should it be? Where should it sound conversational? Where should it be formal? Again, like when we're working with some of our financial services clients, it's really important that there are declarative sentences. That's my favorite thing of saying, of this is a declarative sentence. This is what I'm speaking as fact. Here are other places where I can inject personality. The other thing is, when we're working through a lot of this, I always like to think of, when we're in direct response, we used to call it the brand dial. So the brand's on the left, and then instructional utilitarian direction is on the right. I can't break that dial, but sometimes I might be more brand injected, and therefore maybe the directions aren't as clear. Versus, hey, I'm writing microcopy for directions. That's going to be super utilitarian. It's thinking about those places of where it's appropriate to have that, because we don't get to do brand monologues anymore. We don't get to, a lot of these interactions are a bit conversational, especially if I'm asking a model to talk about my brand. So I have to be mindful of how does that show up? The other parts of it, of what proof should I use? What proof am I pointing at? More than name dropping, how do I make sure that I show that I've done my homework? What are words that we would never ever use? And there's the obvious, but then there's even things of how will I talk about these things so that they relate back to my audience? Where am I going to take a stance, or where am I not even going to have that conversation or have topics on that? That's again something to be very mindful for, especially when these models, especially the web ones, they're trained on Reddit. They're trained on chat and Twitch content and all of that stuff. That is not always the best content in the world. So thinking about where we put those, and then how should they connect? What are those important things that are about us? And then again, what is good? Like, what does that what does good mean? Does that mean it's super clear and it covers this, and that might change a little bit depending on what channel I'm in. But that's an important piece of understanding where am I headed towards, because the more we can say go towards this, the better. But we also need to make sure that it's just not copying, because it just wants to win, is so to speak, of a computer. If any of you, I think this crowd's good enough to know war games, and the whole notion of it just wants to win. That's what it wants to do. So if we think of it that way, let's give it the opportunities to give it the direction to what winning looks like, on our terms, not with, what is it, thermonuclear global warfare, and that type of particular.
Yep. So at the end of the day, we're looking collectively as an industry to shift to better drafts. So it's not a guarantee that you're still not going to have some cleanup work to do, but the idea is you're going to have a better draft from the get-go. So you're basically, a lot of teams today are generating their draft, they're reviewing it, saying it doesn't sound like the brand, it's flat, it sounds like everyone else, it's generic, it's sloppy, whatever. We have, a formal review process. It goes through many, many, many more rounds of review than we used to. I remember back when we used to, brief writers, and it was up to the senior writer to make sure the junior writer had stuff before it went to the creative director. Because of the acceleration of how quickly things are getting drafted, we've created a senior kind of backlog with it. So it's a matter of making sure that some of these more basic things are caught, especially when you're working with more junior level writers, so that they also know what the expectations are. But at the end of the day, a lot of times we have the review, we got a lot of rounds of revisions, potentially miss our publishing deadline. And then we just kind of cross our fingers and hope that it actually gets better and faster and more efficient the next time around.
Well, and that gets lapped up too.
Yeah.
So that one team figures it out.
Yep.
How do we make sure that gets codified? How do we make sure that that gets shared with everyone and it isn't, do that writing duo, they know what they're doing. It's how do we make sure that everyone knows that?
Right.
And that also the client's on board with that.
Right. So the better way, and what we do when we do the work with these systems, is we really focus heavily on that upfront part of the process, the input part. So we're defining the job, we're defining our audience, we have ICP, ideal customer profile or persona documentation. And it's not just, here's Sally, she's 34 and has 2 dogs. It actually gets into need states, what their triggers are, what their fears and frustrations are. So having really deep ICP information, and if you don't have it, being able to use tools like Grok to do social listening if your audience is on Twitter, that's a fantastic way of actually kind of shortcutting the process, because you can do social listening with a Grok skill, and it actually can find the information of what your audience is talking about right now. So it could be brand sentiment, it could be identifying problem states, it could be whatever you need to have the right input. If you don't have your persona documentation, that's a great way to shortcut it. And then also you actually spell out what success looks like. What are you trying to ultimately accomplish with this piece of content, this campaign, etc. Having the right source materials, examples, and proof. Like that is like the biggest thing right there, because I can't tell you how many times at big agencies where we had files squirreled away on different drives within the network, or it was on Dropbox here and this person had it on their computer there. It's having all of that information centralized in a place where you can either access it directly through these tools or adding them easily so that you don't have to go finding all this information. Having the right voice guidance and writing signals, that's another huge component. Like I said, will pay dividends across the ecosystem, not just in the content piece itself. How you go through and codify tone, truth, usefulness, etc. Things that you basically know and likely everyone on this call knows, but it's not necessarily documented. If you have that documented as well, that actually helps to make sure that you're executing against those versus catching that on the back end. The other piece, and this is really interesting, is you can start to do analysis on where the changes come in most frequently and start to identify what needs to be changed in the upfront so you're getting stuff that sounds better on the back end. So you can also look at the types of feedback you're getting and run an analysis of it, and then actually use that to inform some of this documentation that we've been talking about. And then really taking all of these learnings. So you've gone through this process, you've collected all your stuff, you got all your documentation, your voice and tone, whatever. Learn from the process and then iterate and improve. So, it's going to take you a few cycles through, but I assure you, as you've done this work and we can attest to it, it works with our clients, it works with our own stuff, but you're going to continuously learn. You're going to want to tweak things along the way, and it'll just help build upon itself.
Yeah, and some of these things you don't have to recreate every time.
No,
right?
no.
So if I'm doing social posts or I'm doing blog posts or I'm even writing newsletter copy or I'm doing those other things, my source material, my examples, my tone of voice document, once we've got that locked, we only look at that probably from maybe a quarterly basis.
Yeah.
Once you've got that locked.
Yep.
That's so I mean, some of this stuff sounds like, oh, that's really hard. It's setting that up, and then you start to get that. You will have to do some setup work initially, because it isn't an easy button. It is very much that intentional, how do I get everyone agreement on that? Then we can move forward. But then if everyone is using that, there's a centralized place where we can use that. And I noticed we have the comments of the thing. We'll talk a little about where to store that as part of the Q&A of, okay, well, that's great. That sounds wonderful. How do we do that? And there's different ways that we can actually be able to do that.
Yeah. Yep.
So the way that we think of it is this idea of an engine. And it's a loop of capturing where we gather our facts and examples, our facts in our customer language. We use that as also, like, for that customer language, there's opportunities of what's my ideal customer persona look like? Or sometimes when we're helping internal teams, who am I presenting to? What do I know about them? How do I get that stakeholder? How do I present it to make that stakeholder happy? It's using that same idea of how we look at relevance. It's also having the opportunity to actually test against, how do I present this to that CMO that's always caring about X, Y, and Z? Or help me make this a headline because that person's more headline. Wait, there's going to be another person in the room who's analytical and obviously is going to need a little facts. Help me balance that. It's really, really helpful. Or what is my messaging goals? One thing I love about using these generative AI tools is I can look and say, one of the things is if you're looking at a problem, flip it on its head. It's super easy to flip that on its head as opposed to thinking about all of the mental brain power I used to have to do to how do I flip and look at that from a different point of view. That's a really helpful way of getting how that is, so that way then I can move into my target audience, my structure, length. That's a big one, right? Am I writing this for social, or am I writing this for Facebook? Am I writing it as an Instagram? Am I writing this as a newsletter, etc.? It's helping me be able to get those instructions. And again, some more of those guardrails. There was a creative director I used to work with, and he'd always say, give me the healthy, strong fences of a very well-written brief, so I know how hard I can push against it. That's very similar to that idea. And then we look at review. This is one of this is where I think AI slop happens. I know. It's the whole notion of, look at what you're reading. Read it out loud. We still have to do QA and QC. Unfortunately, in this day and age of faster, better, more, we don't always get the better because we aren't doing this QC and QA. So it's checking that expert judgment, making sure. And by the way, this is also an important moment to, if we're pulling web facts, let's verify. Let's make sure that's right. And then iterating. So let's track that review time. Let's see how long it's taking me to now get approvals, or to get how many rounds it takes to create certain pieces. I wouldn't look at it as my whole content marketing thing. I would say, how long does it take me to create a social post? How long does it X, Y, Z? All of those things fall into the process. But as we break that down, that gives us that measurability of knowing where those opportunities of where we've got recurring edits or how we're using it. With strategy teams, we look at that in terms of how long does it take for me to go through the process of looking at insights and analysis, of looking at what those white spaces are or competitives. Then how do I put that into a presentation deck where then I'm going to be coherent, because I'm going to be able to do that against either previous plans or things along those lines. That's again where we're able to kind of get into this loop of how we're able to approach it, and then again sharing that with others, not kind of putting it under a bushel, which that's a whole other presentation about cultural transformation and teams of how to make sure that everyone feels comfortable using those particular things.
So the idea here is you don't want to boil the ocean. You want to start with one tooth and get that tooth polished and then move on to the next tooth. And eventually you end up with a beautiful smile, but we're not going to go through and try to do everything at once. So you really want to pick where is the most painful part of this process. Is it content creation? Is it the strategy part? Is it implementing findings from an audit? Like whatever that pain point is, that's really where you're going to want to start, and then define what good looks like for whatever that process might be. Collecting your examples, do more of these, less of these, find out what works. And that's the other great thing about all this. Once you have the analytics and see how the content has performed, you can actually feed that back into your context as well and actually start to identify what are the themes, trends, audience insights, whatever, to make the content perform even better. So not only can you see the pieces that work better, but you can start to get under the hood and identify structurally why. Was it the hook? Was it the message? Was it the fact that you weren't talking about AI and everyone else was talking about AI? Like what are those different components that you can actually start to identify within your own work and then actually apply? Building those inputs and having that strong central corpus. So whether it's an internal RAG setup, it's set up through Notebook on Copilot, through Microsoft, you've got your projects, wherever that might live, having it set up so that these systems can actually access it and in a safe and protected way, quite frankly. So having all of that information useful and usable for the systems is certainly that third piece. And then run and tighten it. So you're going to run this as almost like a flywheel, as much as I hate that phrase, but you're going to constantly go through the process, optimize, find things that work better, and continually refine it. So the goal is to get a lot of that input stuff out of the way and all that upstream stuff out of the way, so you can really focus then on tightening the drafts, making sure that they're even better when they first get generated, and you have something that you can work with almost from the get-go. I won't say that you'll ever get there, but that's ultimately the goal, is get closer and closer to that.
So as a thank you to everyone here, we have put together a content review checklist. And this is something actually that if you output it, you can actually either throw it right into your LLM, or you can look at it yourself, depending on how much control or how you're feeling with that. I'm a big proponent of going through things once to understand it analog and then allowing it. The more you understand about how things happen, the better. That's actually something we've actually been hearing a bit with agentic work. Folks are like, yeah, we got this agent. It writes the brief. However, the review process is taking just as long as it is eating up all the time we save, because they're going back and almost creating that brief because they don't understand where things were pulled from. So that was, okay, how do we adjust that agent to share, show my homework or being able to cover that. But this checklist is kind of showing from an accuracy standpoint of, hey, double check these things. Tell me where the source material is. Tell me, a lot of times it's give me the notation of where you found this, and then I will look. That voice check that we've talked about, so it's sounding correct. The AI signature removal, which is those odd phrases, those telltale things that, all of these systems, again, are trained on human writing. The problem is that it kind of just took all the things of, like, if you think of it like a shopping cart, and, ooh, that's good, that's good, that's good. And then that's where we suddenly see all of these things showing up and going, ooh, that's not right. It's taking all of the highlights, oof. And then the utility check of, hey, this is the brief. This is what we set out to do. Am I meeting the brief? Did we actually align with, we were supposed to tell people X, Y, and Z, and it's supposed to have a call to outcome of such and such. Does it really have that? Let's make sure that then we haven't drifted ourselves, because as humans, we can drift, and very much so, these just drift even more.
Yep.
So that basically our website with rate/checklist will be able to get you to a point where you can download that.
Yep. So really, based on where we're at right now, please grab the checklist. It's free, it's accessible, and it actually will, like Sue said, it's something you can even drop in or extract the text out of as a markdown file, put it into your process and start to use it. So please take advantage of that. The other thing is to really look for within your process things that keeps happening. So whether it's good or bad, just kind of be aware of where, like what's consistently coming up, and then start to look at how do we start to address those problems so that they don't keep happening again. The last piece of it is we do have a content engine that we built ourselves where you can actually take the process and the framework that we've used with our clients and with ourselves. And so there's a self-service version. There's also a guided version where we can actually help you implement it for yourself. So if you want support on how do I start to create some of this voice and tone documentation, how do I collate and collect all that information that we talked about during the presentation, you have that ability as well. So we're not going to just say, good luck, here you go. We have the ability to help you as well if that's something that you at all need. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions. So thank you so much. And yeah, I know there are a couple questions in the comments already.
Yep, thanks so much, Scott and Susan. We first question comes from Kathy. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question, Kathy?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you build out this corpus of
Mhm.
of work that is your voice and your refined guidelines and all of that, where do you actually put it in the AI? So I'm familiar with, putting like building on project and adding in materials there, but where do you put it so that it governs your whole AI universe, no matter what chat you're in or what project you're in, etc.
Is that Claude specific or?
I use Claude, I use ChatGPT, I use Gemini. I'm kind of I kick back and forth and check them against each other, like what you were talking
Yeah, yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. Okay. I mean, the best way I found is to have it specific for a project. So I've got a master projects created for, our mid-tier offerings for content and
Yep.
things like that. And I make it specific. So like if you're an agency, it would be akin to setting up a project folder for each client and having all of that individual. I basically kind of replicate that thought process specifically within Claude. So it would be clients and then subfolders within it, and then you can even drag those types of things directly into Claude. But
Yeah.
it's helpful to have it all in the project level. I haven't figured out a great way to get Claude to share that. I mean, through memory you
Mhm.
can start to get there, but it's not. I don't want to cross
Yeah.
contaminate and have insights from one client show up in another place. So I've never really tried to implement something at that global level. But it's the same thing with custom GPTs,
Yeah.
having those baked in specifically. The other cool thing is with skills, you can also bake those into the projects and invoke those on a project basis. So like there's a lot of open source skills that you can download off of GitHub with like marketing, psychology, and like best practices for landing page conversion content and things like that. And effectively, those are prompts that people created, built into a skill, and then have posted up on GitHub so you can grab those and either make your own adjustments or just use them outright. So that's kind of the cool thing. You can start to nest not only the context, but some of these skills to really improve the output. And it, like, I can tell you for a fact that when you do that, it goes from sounding something completely generic to like you almost have to back it off because then it gets super verbose and you get these like really long outputs. And it's like, helpful to a point. So it's like, all right, I like this, and let's kind of retrofit for what my needs are.
Yeah. And one of the things we do to manage too is we use Google Docs.
Yeah.
So you can have all of your voice and tone content. And let's say, because the big thing is some of our clients are locked into Copilot and they will never go anywhere else. So we can use that within the Copilot agents or even within Notebook. But if otherwise, like he uses a lot more Claude than I do. Don't tell Anthropic because we're supposed to be partners. But I use a lot of ChatGPT projects. But what we'll do is we'll house that as either a centralized Word doc or as a Google Doc. I like Google Docs because you can download an MD file. I don't know how many folks here are familiar with Markdown files. Awesome. Like I've gotten in the habit of I can just download that Markdown file. We are sharing it between each other. So when I talked about that quarterly review, we're able to do that. Another thing we do, and this is actually a really tactical, once a week, we'll pull down all of our LinkedIn performance between the two of us, share that as markdown files, and then read and look at how we're doing, what's doing really, really well. Let's do a quick analysis. What do we need to tweak for the upcoming week or two? That's been a really helpful thing. Another case in point would be I recently have a panel, and I'm not going to push it here, but you can check it out. You'll see it on my LinkedIn of we're a panel for Panel Picker. I wanted to write a post. I went and said, all right, let's look at the best performing, most engaged Panel Picker posts. Help me write one that follows the right thing and isn't so I'm able to kind of step on the shoulders of others. There's all sorts of instances where you can do that. You write that and then have that analysis put into and either use it as your project. Like I have a social content project. I can use those things within there again, or let's codify it either as a markdown file that I can share in other models. But that's kind of the analog way if you're using it from a standpoint of quick and easy. I think someone's asking about using a RAG. Yeah, that is a way of, or MCP of having that library. And you can do that if it's your SharePoint or particular looking within there and maintaining it. We can talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but those are also places where if your IT department or your team, you have a big enough team to do that, that's fine. But if you're a smaller, more nimble team, you don't necessarily always have to get that far deep into it. It's a matter of making sure you've got the communication channels that put that within there. Another place is even just using that, I believe it's called Notes in Slack, where you just start putting the links of here's where our prompt library is, here's where the latest brand voice, and just as many places as possible, which I think we're all used to doing once we get that stuff of please use it, please get to it, continuing to let people know where to pull that from.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sure, hope that helps.
The other interesting thing about doing the Google Doc thing that she'd mentioned is if you have multiple tabs with the entire project history, so the first call transcript from the prospect all the way through, like here's the stakeholder interviews or whatever. If you have it all in the same document, you can actually download that entire file and then you can quickly create a case study because your entire project history is actually within that Google Doc. So like that's another cool thing that I kind of backed into. Like we've been doing that because it makes proposal creation easier and a bunch of other stuff. But it also has made like generating your case studies after the fact so much easier because it's all centralized in one place.
Do you give your your AI, do you give it access to your Google Docs and like your Drive and that kind of stuff? How do you manage that?
Some of them I do, some of them I don't. And it's just kind of a personal preference on that. But I mean, anytime you have access to your files,
Right.
things can happen. So I
Exactly.
tend to be more conservative when it comes to that type of a thing. I'm also not running agents all over the place because I don't trust that it's just gonna right now just go
Yeah.
off and do things that I don't want it to do. So like I'm not
Right.
using agents for email. I could, but I choose not to. And
Right.
so it's like for us, it's try things in the process, figure out where it works, figure out where we're comfortable you doing it, and then kind of rolling and scaling. So like the whole agent thing, we have clients come to us all the time where like you guys don't even have your foundation set, you don't have your document, your workflows aren't documented, your files are all over the place. You're physically not like less than 50% of the organization is opening Copilot, let's say. You're not ready for agents. Like external facing stuff, maybe it's customer research or like competitive, fine. But anything internal, like you want to make sure you have the underlying system set up. Otherwise, you're just going to be scaling broken things and it's going to make it worse.
And a lot of governance actually hasn't accounted for agents. I mean, a lot of governance hasn't accounted for a lot of things like AI policy of does your AI policy, it may say we don't do bad things or we use these things or we don't use AI to do all of our work. That's fine. But does your AI policy tell your team members and your clients, here's actually what I do and I don't do? If that's not clear, you need to make it clear. And it might be fine that if on your website you keep it to that high level, just know that there needs to be a deeper level to that policy. When it comes to agents governance, and this is a big discussion of, as people are saying, oh, everyone can just build one. Do you really want that? Do you want that many pipes out of your organization? Or and a lot of times where we end up with initially with those clients is the IT department says, here are 3 very specific use cases that we will build an agent for that everyone can get used to and that we know we can have, basically we have a kill switch for, because that's where that comes to. A lot of local AI is where a lot of folks play when you're looking at those agents. I, again, like both of us, I've seen the good and the bad, and therefore, and I don't want to discourage, but I very much want to be a human, at least either in or on the loop. It's very rarely that I'm out of the loop of where they're working autonomously. Like Scott said, it's for things of I think the risk that comes to it, and to think of it this way: what happens if something goes wrong? What is the risk of that? What is then the consequence? And a lot of times with our clients, they're like, you know what, we need to walk that back.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
And with that, I think we are out of time. So Susan and Scott, thanks so much for joining us. I'll
Yeah, thank
hope to
you.
see you around town. And for the rest of you, check our schedule for more meetups.
Sure, absolutely. And if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to hit us up on LinkedIn.
Yep.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
That was
Everyone.
All
great.
right. Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Bye-bye.